Welcome, everyone, to session 5 of the story, Genesis. We continue our journey through this first book of the Bible, the story of how God's story begins. Today, we will look at chapter 16, the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Before we dive into this story, a few things must be said. One, this is a most difficult story for a number of reasons. There is no talking around the fact that Hagar is mistreated in this story, especially according to our contemporary standards. Yet, we read this story as part of the bigger story of God's involvement with God's people, the unfolding story of God's activity, and ultimately God's love. We read this story not to get caught up in the details or speculation about what may or may not have been behind this story, but rather to see how this story fits in with the larger story of God's activity. In chapter 15, as we studied last week, God promises to God's servants, Abram and Sarai, an heir. God promises to Abram and Sarai that they shall be the parents of a multitude of people. They shall have many descendants, and they shall be given a land. However, as we begin Genesis chapter 16, we see that God's promise of an heir has not yet come to be. It has not yet happened. Abram and Sarai remain childless. Abram and Sarai grow impatient at this point in waiting for God's promise to come to fruition. Perhaps some of us can relate to how Abram and Sarai might have been feeling. God promises us something, but that promise doesn't seem to be happening, at least not according to our timeline. And so Abram and Sarai find themselves in a position of waiting in anguish, waiting in struggle, waiting in grief. And that is where Genesis chapter 16 begins. Look with me at Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. Therein lies the problem. Therein lies the emotional angst with which Abram and Sarai find themselves. However, in the second half of verse 1 we read, she, Sarai, had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. Right here in verse 1, a theological question is raised about God. Can one trust in God and in God's promises when those promises have not yet come to be? This is the theological question that lies behind all of Genesis chapter 16. Will God be faithful? Can God be trusted? What are Abraham and Sarah supposed to do as they wait? Continuing then with verse 2. Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." Giving slave girls to one's husband to bear a child was a common practice and custom during biblical times. While certainly morally detestable according to modern standards on a number of fronts, Sarai's actions do reflect an acceptable legal practice in her day. That does not excuse how Sarai treats Hagar, but it does explain the context in which Sarai found herself. A larger issue here is that Abram and Sarai, at least here, despite the fact that they are models of faithfulness elsewhere in the biblical story, here they do not trust or believe in God's promise to them. In fact, here they failed to trust. Instead of waiting on God to act as God had promised them, Abram and Sarai decide to take matters into their own hands. They decide to be the agents of their own futures. Instead of trusting God, Abram and Sarai decide to depend on themselves, on their own actions, on their own trying to remain in control. Faith, of course, is believing in that which we cannot yet see, or that which we cannot yet fully know. Because Abram and Sarai did not yet have a child as God had promised them, Abram and Sarai doubt God's promises. This is where Abram and Sarai falter, and this is where the story begins to get complicated. Follow along with me now as I read from the end of verse 2 through verse 6. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. Here is a classic triangulated relationship between Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. Sarai is upset with Hagar because Hagar looks with contempt upon her. Sarai then transfers her anger and her frustration upon Abram. But Abram turns that frustration back on Sarai. In the end, all three of these persons, Abram, Hagar, and Sarai, are at odds one with another. Abram and Sarai's decision to follow their own way rather than trusting in God's way has led to a disintegration of their shared relationships, one with another. Perhaps the most disturbing part of these verses is the end of verse 6, when it says, Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and Hagar ran away from her. The picture of Hagar that we get here at the end of verse 6 is as someone who has now been completely abandoned by her mistress Sarai, abandoned by Hagar, by Abram. We see Hagar as being totally and utterly alone. Someone who is utterly and totally outside of any relationship with anyone upon whom she can depend. However, the story takes an interesting turn beginning in verse 7. I invite you to follow along with me as I read. The angel of the Lord found Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi." For she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. In the moment of Hagar's complete loneliness and isolation at having been cast out by Sarai, God shows up in Hagar's life, reminding Hagar that she is not alone and that in God's own way she too is not completely left out of God's promises. An angel appears to Hagar in her loneliness and isolation. God turns toward her. The temptation throughout this story is for Abraham to trust in his own action rather than in the promise of God. The birth of Ishmael is a kind of testing for Abram. Will he be threatened in his relationship with God by this new Ishmael? Or will he continue to trust? Will he continue to be faithful? Interestingly, in response to the angel's visit, in response to God's showing up to Hagar, Hagar gives God a name, El Roi. Hagar is the only human in the entire biblical story to give God a name. She expresses awe after seeing God and still remaining alive. Literally, the name El Roi means something like, "The God who sees me lives." Even in the midst of an utterly hopeless, seemingly hopeless situation for Hagar, we take note that God still sees her. God still notices her. God, in God's own way, is still with her. And God promises to be part of Hagar's story through her son Ishmael and through Ishmael's descendants. Let's finish out chapter 16 by reading verses 15 and 16. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Sarah's initiative in circumventing the promise has brought conflict into the story. Conflict between her and Hagar, conflict between her and Abram. The promise of God to Abraham and Sarah seems to now be in jeopardy. Yet we get a glimpse at the end of this story of Abram's return to faithfulness. Abram obeys God's command to Hagar to name her son Ishmael. Abram is obedient to God in giving Hagar's son this name. God's promise had been given to Abraham and Sarah. They, like us, fail to trust in God's promise. They take their own actions. They try to take control, and relationships are damaged. There is still a long wait ahead for Abraham and Sarah, but God will remain faithful. God will keep God's promises. God can be trusted in all things and at all times.